You must have been a time of frustration.
With some frustration, but meanwhile, I did another national study analogous to the study on rural development. This was one on what we call the Agricultural Technology Delivery System.
Mm-hmm.
This was a 3-year contract study for Department of Agriculture, looking at the land-grant university system and Agricultural Research Service and various other entities that were in the business of creating and disseminating agricultural technology. And that, again, got me in touch with the entire university system. And again, I was faced with the strengths, but also the limitations
mm-hmm.
of that system. And again, I was challenged with, how do you fix it? How do you rotate the system or influence the institution, the reward structure, so that people will not be inhibited from doing the kinds of things that they really want to do. I had professors say to me, I'd really love to do the kind of work you're doing, but I can't. I can turn out 10 reductionist journal articles in the time that it would take me to do one of the kind of studies that you do.
Mm-hmm.
And since they're being paid and promoted and given tenure and so forth on the basis of their publication list, I could understand.
That hasn't changed.
And that hasn't changed. I've also found that the academic community was innocent, naive of the realities of what was going on those farms.
Mm-hmm.
And I began publishing case studies. And people would read these case studies and just say, oh, that's not science. That's, and they're right within their own philosophy of science,
mm-hmm.
which has to do with taking pretty much canned hypotheses and doing, replicated experiments where all the treatments are well known in advance and predetermined inputs and so forth.
Controlled.
Very, very carefully controlled. My view of science is somewhat more eclectic than that, and that is there's a prior process that precedes all of that, which generates new hypotheses, comes up with new paradigms, and very much influenced by the book of Thomas Kuhn, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions,
mm-hmm.
and the idea that real progress in science comes through the invention of new paradigms. And we get these new paradigms through our experience that is outside our own area of specialization, through interdisciplinary work, through contact with practitioners, farmers, others. At least that's my own personal philosophy of science. And that from this, then, you may come up with ideas that deserve to be tested. And initially, many of these ideas are not amenable to controlled experiments
mm-hmm.
at the early stages. And particularly in organic agriculture or regenerative or sustainable agriculture, management is the #1 input. It is a very sensitive, intuitive kind of management that sets the successful organic farmer apart from those who fail and from those who use kind of a cookbook approach to farming. Now that management process involves a number of so-called treatments that really cannot be predetermined. And you wander through your fields and you see bugs or you see beneficials, you see evidence of certain soil nutrient deficiencies and so forth, and you take remedial action. You take preventive, preparatory action to build a long-term productivity in your soil and to enhance the populations of your beneficials and so forth. That, you see, it doesn't fit neatly into the greenhouse or laboratory experimental process. But having done some exploratory work in this area and having done some screening of various approaches and having carefully observed and monitored and measured what they're doing and how they're doing it, from that process then can come a whole new generation of laboratory greenhouse experiments. A beautiful example came up at a conference in Ohio a couple of months ago, or not Ohio, Hawaii,
mm-hmm.
a couple of months ago. Farmers were talking about how they were controlling various diseases and pests and so forth. One of the major ones was nematodes. And I had encountered farmers who were trying things like planting California poppies because they are alleged to have an allelopathic property of emitting an nematicide from the plant tissue as they decompose and so forth. And I had encountered a farmer in the Central Valley of California who was doing exactly that. He had overseeded California poppies in his orchard. And he said that over a period of years, and he was going to see whether his the strip that had the California poppies did any better than a comparison strip next to it that did not have the poppies. Well, farmers very frequently criticize researchers because we take so long to come up with findings. Well, here was a farmer who was doing an experiment that was going to take a very long time to come up with results, but they were not going to be findings in the scientific sense, and that you would not be able to tell what was happening between those two areas. Were they really comparable, soils and so forth? Were there other factors that were intervening and interacting with his treatment of overseeding those California poppies? It was going to take a long time to get some very soft data. In contrast, Professor McHenry at the Kearney Agriculture Research Center in Southern California established some comparison plots, some pots within his research area, where he actually planted California poppies in soils that he knew were infected with certain kinds of nematodes. He had actually introduced the nematodes to this pure soil, and then introduced various cover crops, and over a period of a growing season, then he was able to monitor the populations of the nematodes as related to different cover crops. And he found that the root knot nematode, which is one of the major pests, thrived on California poppies, but they were killed by black-eyed Susans. Now, this is, I think, a beautiful example of how a scientist can pick up on some anecdotal information, some ideas that farmers have generated, maybe from folklore, maybe from their intuition or whatever, reducing that to some very carefully controlled tests and really unlock what is happening. And I've seen a number of cases like that. And this, I think, summarizes what I consider to be the ideal world of the interaction between the farmer and the scientist. The other part of that loop is getting that information back to the farmer in a form that they can use and that will be valid for that farmer's resources. For example, maybe the findings that McHenry came up with would be appropriate in that particular climatic situation and the soils that he used, but perhaps not for others. So it needs to be replicated in different areas, and it needs to be tried out on actual farm situations. And this closes the loop, the information loop between the farmer and the scientist.
Do you see that this kind of case study approach is what you were involved with Lisa and still are? Yes,
and even before that with the National Academy of Sciences, this report called Alternative Agriculture.
This one?
When the committee producing that book found that as they studied the literature, all of the literature was reductionist, or virtually all of it was reductionist in nature, and then it dealt with, part of it would deal with nematodes, part would deal with insects, part would deal with soil fertility and so forth, but it was not coming together. And Bob Miller, the chair of that committee, was rather frustrated by that, and he knew of my work, my case studies, and he came to me, or had the Board on Agriculture chair come to me and asked me to pick up where I left off with my case studies, to refresh them, expand them. I went back to the Paviches and the Lundbergs and the Ferraris and a number of others, and got new data, expanded the range of information, and traveled there with various experts and so forth, and came up with a number of case studies. The second half of that book is composed of case studies which I either authored or edited. Because the case studies pull together all of that information and integrate it in a very tangible way. The readers can say, okay, here is a specific farm with specific soil type, climate and so forth. Here are the crops that have been grown, and here's what the yields and so forth. It made it tangible. It brought the thing alive.
Which farmers really appreciate.
Farmers appreciate it, but also many, not all, but many in the scientific community appreciate it. Again, many in the scientific community shrieked in horror and said, "That's not science." Well, again, I respect that. I understand the scientific philosophical position from which they're coming when they say that. I just happen to disagree. I prefer to take a much more eclectic approach to science.